We all have our weaknesses. For some, it's beautiful women. For others, it's fast cars. But for Garrison Keillor, it is sweet corn. As some of you probably know, Keillor hails from the fictional town of Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, or as he says, the little town that time forgot and the decades could not improve, where all the women are strong, all the men are good-looking, and all the children are above average. He remembers those Sunday afternoons from his childhood when the pot roast was done and the potatoes were mashed and a pot of water was boiling on the stove. Then and only then, he says, would my father go out to the garden with a bushel basket and pick 30 ears of corn. We would shuck them clean in 5 seconds per ear, pop them into the pot, a quick prayer, a little butter and salt, and that is as good as it gets. Sweet corn was his family's weakness. He said they were prepared to resist atheistic communism, immoral Hollywood, hard liquor, gambling and dancing, smoking and fornication. But if Satan had come around with sweet corn, we would have at least listened to what he had to say. We might not have bought it, but we would have had him in for a cup of coffee. For some, it's sweet corn. For others, it's something else. But Garrison Keillor is right about this. Temptation always seems to find our weak spot. Think about Eve in the Garden of Eden. God had given her everything she needed, everything she wanted, really, except for that one thing, that forbidden fruit from the tree in the center of the garden. The more she thought about it, the more she wanted it, until soon it was all she could think about. As Adam slept beside her on the lush green grass of paradise, she lay awake wondering how that fruit would taste. The Bible tells us she was tempted by a serpent, but I believe she was tempted long before that. The serpent may have only put into words what she was already thinking. You will not die if you eat this fruit. God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will know good and evil and be like God in that regard. As far as we know, there wasn't anything special about this tree except that it was forbidden. Might have been an ordinary apple tree, a Granny Smith, a Golden Delicious. But Eve didn't know that. She believed that this tree had magical properties and that if she ate of its fruit, she would suddenly know the difference between good and evil, which, of course, she did. As soon as she sank her teeth into its firm and juicy flesh, she knew, I have done an evil thing. That's how temptation is. Never as strong as we might imagine, but always aware of our weak spots. In today's gospel reading, Luke tells us that even Jesus was tempted. And if we're going to take the Bible seriously, we need to understand this as a real temptation, not just a demonstration of Jesus' superior wisdom and strength, but a sweat-soaked struggle with the forces of evil. Jesus came out better than Eve. He won. But we have to get over the idea that it was easy for him, that he dismissed the devil with a wave of his hand, saying, "Man shall not live by bread alone." We need to recognize that in his humanity, even Jesus had a weak spot, and temptation touched him precisely there. It began with his baptism. When Jesus came up out of the water, God told him, "You are my Son, the beloved. In you I am well pleased." It was immediately after that, Luke tells us, that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness where he was tempted by the devil for 40 days. It sounds like some kind of test, doesn't it? In fact, the word that we translate temptation can also mean to test, in the way you might test some substance in a chemistry lab to see what it is made of. That's what happens in the wilderness. The devil tests Jesus to see what he is made of. He had just been told that he was the beloved Son of God, but maybe he spent those 40 days wondering what it meant to be God's Son. What is the Son of God supposed to do? What is the Son of God supposed to say? How is God's Son supposed to begin his work in the world? Is it possible that Jesus wasn't as sure about the answers to those questions as we sometimes assume? What would you do if someone told you that you were God's beloved? How would you go to work? Jesus must have thought about it, prayed about it, and eventually come to feel some measure of certainty about it. Maybe he whispered to himself, "I am the Son of God." And then maybe he said it a little louder and a little louder until he was shouting it at the top of his voice so that it echoed off the boulders and down the canyons. Maybe, just maybe, he sat down panting for breath after that. He was hungry. Remember, 40 days without food. He was right where temptation wanted him. And that's when the tempter came, catching Jesus at his most vulnerable moment. But listen to the first words out of his mouth. "If you are the Son of God, then prove it. Turn these stones into bread." It was a tempting thought. Maybe, as with Eve, the tempter only put into words what Jesus was thinking already. As hungry as he was, those smooth, round rocks in the desert must have looked like loaves of bread. And if he really was the Son of God, he could do a little thing like that, couldn't he? Hadn't God caused bread to fall from heaven in the wilderness to feed his people? Hadn't he brought water gushing forth from a rock in the desert? Jesus was the Son of God. He could do those things. And if he did, he might satisfy not only his hunger, but the hunger of all God's people. They would come to the desert and find there all the food they needed. And that's when it hit him. Maybe that's what the Son of God was supposed to do. Feed God's people. Give bread to the world. It was a tempting thought. And Jesus struggled with it, not only because it sounded so reasonable, but because it sounded so much like his own voice. His empty belly, his aching brain made a good case, and it was all he could do to remember the scripture that says, "No one can live by bread alone." As soon as he said it out loud, he knew that it was true. But he was still hungry, still weak. And then the voice came again. This time it came from high up on a mountain, a place where Jesus could see all the kingdoms of the world stretched out beneath him. "All of this can be yours," the voice said, "if you will only worship me." It was a tempting thought. In the space of 40 days, Jesus had realized that being the Son of God was not everything he might have imagined. It meant always putting God's will before your own. It meant being rejected by the very people you had come to serve. It meant loneliness and persecution and pain. How tempting it must have been to change all that, to put himself first and take his seat on a throne. Isn't that what people would expect of the Son of God? It would be so easy to give it to them. In fact, it would be too easy. In a flash, Jesus saw that the real temptation was not to worship the devil, but to worship himself, to put himself before the Father and forget why he had come. With a quiet strength forged in those 40 days of endurance, Jesus said, "You shall worship the Lord your God and serve only him." But the tempter wasn't finished with him.